art. These songs were interesting. You know, the way that they energized the music scene, it suddenly seemed like everybody wanted to form a band. And I think a lot of folk musicians began to think, okay, well, what's the next stage of things here? You know, folk seemed to have reached its end point. You know, I mean, the Beatles put a period, you know, at the end of folk music in the United States, in a way.
That world was fractured culturally by the release of the freewheeling Bob Dylan and certainly 12 by 5 by the Rolling Stones. Those were the first clear signals that anti-establishment thought could be so commercially acceptable, and thought-driven music, especially folk music, could be part of the solution to what we felt was a society gone mad with Vietnam and growing as a concern. And in '63, you must remember the assassination of John Kennedy traumatized this nation, shook it up absolutely in an unimagined way. So, yeah, it was time for a shakeup, and 12 by 5 by the Stones was sent a clear message to Americans who were singing folk music in coffee houses. Electricity wasn't all bad.
The commercial folk boom, which Roger McGuinn and David Crosby and Gene Clark had all been a part of, was dying. And a big part of that was the Beatles and the British Invasion, too. As soon as they hit and they had the top 5 records in the United States one week, all of those musicians were literally trying to get their hands on an electric guitar and get their hair to grow.
Clark and McGuinn proved to be no exception, and their worlds finally collided one night at the Troubadour Club in Los Angeles, where McGuinn was performing Beatles covers on a 12-string guitar.
I don't think a lot of people appreciated it at the Troubadour initially. It was kind of almost like a novelty act, this idea of this guy doing Beatles stuff. But Gene Clark arrived at the same time, similar road to the Troubadour, and he was entranced by the Beatles, and he saw what McGuinn was doing and really liked it. So he was the first one to approach him. So you had the two together, and they elected to maybe go out as a Peter and Gordon act. We both play acoustic guitar. We're both, you know, pretty good singers. I mean, Gene Clark's a, you know, really great singer, and his voice works pretty well with McGuinn's. So that was the original idea, and they started, you know, practicing at the Troubadour in the stairwell there. And it was at that point that another guy entered the scene and heard them, and that was David Crosby.
David Crosby was another young refugee from the commercial folk boom. Having travelled America in pursuit of the roaming folk musician lifestyle, financial realities had persuaded him to throw in his lot with one of the popular touring combos.
Rather like McGuinn with the Chad Mitchell Trio, rather like Gene Clark with the New Christie Minstrels, he decided he'd join an aggregation called the Les Baxter Balladeers, where, you know, he would just be, he'd have to dress up in this terrible kind of red velvet suit and go out there and play the straight roll singing angelically, but, you know, with his hair cut short and looking very much straight. But it didn't last very long. But again, I guess it got him some experience, and he eventually returned to Hollywood and joined the folk circuit there. He was, you know, playing clubs like the Unicorn, and basically trying to establish himself as a solo act.
David Crosby said in his first book that when he saw me when he and David Lindley were in Santa Barbara, and they saw me and my brother play at a coffee house, David Crosby turned to David Lindley and he said, "If they can get away with it, so can we." And I was very happy to be an anecdote in David's illustrious bio.
However, Crosby's meandering incarnation as a solo act terminated in the stairwell of the Troubadour Club. His encounter with kindred spirits in McGuinn and Clark collectivized their ambition and pointed the way to a new kind of project.
David Crosby had already had some recordings produced on him by Jim Dixon And Roger McGuinn, it's kind of well known, he was doing Beatles songs as a solo folk musician at the Troubadour. I think they all realized that by teaming up and forming a Beatles-like group, they had a much better chance.
And in Gene Clark, they had somebody that could write songs. I mean, like Lennon McCartney almost. I mean, he could do lots of Beatley type songs. And they were good. They were good pastiche of Beatles songs at the beginning. But that's what they were focusing upon. And Crosby's ace card really was knowing Jim Dixon, who was a kind of a jack of all trades, freelance producer, great experience in jazz and folk fields, and he had access to World Pacific Studios and could record people he liked. I mean, he could go to a club like the Troubadour and go up to a guy and say, "Do you want to record?" And I'll record with you. Basically, it won't cost you anything, and we'll shop it around, see if we can get a deal.
For young musicians in the 60s, it was, as everybody says, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Not necessarily in that order, but pretty good. The young musicians would sell their soul to get in a 6-night-a-week rock and roll band. And so much creativity came out. I believe the English influence had such a great turning point in the early 60s. I was fortunate enough to be in a group called a Wrecking Crew that we worked 4 sessions a day, 5 and 6 days a week. In the morning, it may be country. In the afternoon, it could be with Henry Mancini for me. In the afternoon, it could be with Phil Spector, and at night, it could be anybody. In those days, the record companies were not so restricted. The budgets were smaller. They could take a chance on recording a new artist, a young rock group from the 60s. It didn't cost a lot of money. There was not a lot of payola in Los Angeles, and everybody could get a chance to be heard. I think it was a very important period of time for music in the 60s in Los Angeles.
Jim Dixon was sufficiently impressed by McGuinn, Clark and Crosby to take a chance in trying to shape a band. Along with his partner Eddie Tickner, Dixon offered his management services and access to World Pacific recording studios, where the group began rehearsing under the name The Jet Set. It was during these sessions that the band's lineup was augmented by Michael Clark joining on drums and Chris Hillman, a mandolin player with a bluegrass group named the Hillmen, taking bass.
I'll never forget, the Dillards were playing at the Troubadour, and I was sitting up in the balcony with Gene Clark. Now, Gene Clark was good friends with the Dillards. Anyway, I'll never forget, we're sitting up there, and he borrowed 35 cents to buy a pack of cigarettes from me. He says, "Byron, do you got any money?" And I says, "Yeah." So I gave him 35 cents. He went and bought a pack of cigarettes. So he came back up, lit up a cigarette, and he says, "I want to make a lot of money next year, I think, Byron." "Is that right? So what are you going to do?" "Well, I'm getting a new band together." I says, "Yeah." And he said, "Yeah, I think it's going to do really well. I just have a feeling it's going to do really well." I said, "Well, maybe you can pay me back that 35 cents. Just always kidded him about that. I said, "I don't ever want your 35 cents. I want you to owe it to me." And it was the Byrds. And I don't know if he told me the name of it then. I mean, he might have told me that it was going to be. He says, "No, it's not bluegrass." I said, "Well, I don't expect it is. If you want to make any money, it's not going to be bluegrass music."
Jim Dixon was producing them, and Jim was a good friend of mine. And he had his own ideas. He put the Byrds together, you might say. If I'm telling the truth, this is what I think. I don't think the Byrds had any ideas whatsoever, and Jim Dixon put it all together for them, except Roger McGuinn kind of had his own style. He was an individual stylist, you know. You know it when you hear him. But Jim put it all together. As far as I know, Chris couldn't even play bass until he started working with them. They had somebody else do the sessions with a bass, then Chris just copied it. He was good at that.
Jim Dixon was the main force behind it all, trying to keep them together and being encouraging. He was very good at encouraging your music and stuff like that. Very easygoing, if they'd have a riff or something, he'd put it all back together. And Eddie Tickner was the same way. They were really neat guys. And probably the best duo of managers and people like that, and an engineer and the producers, that combination I knew at that time, they were really great.
Left to their own devices, the Byrds might have been thinking, we're going to try and sound like the Beatles as much as possible, or like the Searchers or Peter and Gordon, some of those other early groups that had kind of a general melodic influence. And Jim Dixon, and it's been said many times, but I think it's absolutely true, he was absolutely vital in getting them to set their sights higher as far as the material that they were writing and covering. Of course, it was Jim Dixon who suggested that they cover Bob Dylan, especially Mr. Tambourine Man, but a bunch of Bob Dylan songs, because I think Jim Dixon realized it's not enough to have some good-looking young guys who can sing and play well try and sound like the Beatles. They have to do material that's both kind of like the Beatles, but it's obviously different and it's not imitating them. And a great way to do that would be to blend their Beatlesque elements with the folk material of a singer-songwriter like Bob Dylan.
Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. I'm not sleepy, and there is no place I'm going to. Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. In the jingle jangle morning, I'll come following you.
Dixon revered Bob Dylan. He'd met him in '64, and Dylan played him some stuff back then, and he was entranced by it. He suddenly saw Dylan as the great messiah, I suppose, in one sense, and he was keen that the Byrds do a Dylan song. I mean, he said to me that Mr. Tambourine Man was more important than the Byrds. And end of story. Like, if they didn't do Tambourine Man, that was the end of it, and they didn't want to do it. I mean, he introduced them to Mr. Tambourine Man and said, here's a song I want you to do, and not one of them wanted to do it. All for different reasons, but not one of them wanted to do it. And the most vociferous of all in denouncing it was David Crosby.
Though I know that evening's empire has returned into sand, vanished from my hand, left me blindly here to stand, but still not sleeping.
A personal intervention at World Pacific from Dylan himself assuaged the band's doubts over Mr. Tambourine Man. In late 1964, the group, having by now changed their name to the Byrds, signed a 4-title recording contract with Columbia Records and assented to Dixon's plan for the electrification of Tambourine Man.
By happenstance, the month that Dylan arrived at World Pacific Studios, the Animals had just hit with House of the Rising Sun.